Hi, I'm Jake Matatyaou, Liberal Arts Coordinator here at SCI-Arc. Today I'm joined with Simon Critchley, the Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. Simon, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Very nice to be here, Jake.
I thought we'd begin our conversation with the subject of teaching. Architecture is both professional training and critical inquiry, which is one of the reasons why SCI-Arc in recent years has placed such a strong emphasis on the liberal arts. But the dominance of STEM disciplines within and outside of academia puts pressure on a cultural practice like architecture to instrumentalize design knowledge at the expense of engaging questions of aesthetics, ethics, and politics. As an educator within the humanities, can you make a case for their importance at a time when so many students see higher education as a transactional exchange or an investment?
I mean, there's a whole kind of profession and procession of books by the profession on defense of the humanities, which always makes me a little bit cautious, because they're usually people writing those books are usually in places that are very well defended against all sorts of things, usually by large endowments. And the humanities, you know, do I want to defend the humanities? I don't know. The word humanities is not a word I'm very enthusiastic about. Philosophy, yes, definitely. I want to defend philosophy, and defend philosophy as a space where, you know, something that is not reducible to artistic experience, aesthetic experience, or scientific explanation takes place. And it's that, I mean, that where I begin to focus. I think the reduction of education to STEM, it's understandable, but it's a disaster, because everything becomes a kind of in order to instrumental structure. You learn this in order to have this skill, in order to be more attractive on the market, in order to make money and have a wonderful life. And those of us that have been through education, or those of us, you know, like me, it wasn't like that. It was about, you know, you felt like a weirdo, and you found a place where there were other weirdos. Those were educational institutions. It seemed difficult. It also seemed enjoyable. And the important things were often accidental and not instrumental. So it became a question of, you know, just being in a situation where there would be people who would say strange and compelling things, and that would have an effect on you and take you off down a different avenue. And I can see now, you know, 30 odd years after I went through formal education, that it was those weird accidental bypaths that led to really interesting avenues. So it's a question of just, of non-instrumentalizing education. My view is that science is right? You know, to that extent, I'm a naturalist. So the scientific explanation science gives us the best possible picture of nature that we have, and it's wonderful. And it's necessary for an understanding of the way things are, but not sufficient. And what it is often left out is the area that we can think of as culture, the humanities, literature, philosophy, all those things that concern me. And often the way those two things are talked about, let's say science and art, would again be in terms of, you know, these two dimensions of human activity are both important, but they're on the way to some higher unified theory of everything that would unify the whole structure. I think that's a delusion. I think that things that science for me is a modest, humble enterprise defined by fallibilism, and that's really important. And science is about knowledge, but not necessarily about certainty, and a knowledge which is always pushing at the edges of what is unknown. And it works through imaginative leaps, right? Accidents, you know, which is what was the case with someone like Einstein early on. And I think the humanities is very similar. It allows certain forms of knowledge to to appear, to accrue, but they're modest, they're humble, they're fallible, they can change the aspect under which you see things, and they're different kinds of things. Science does a certain kind of activity very well, literature, art does another kind of activity very well, and we're often confused about what kind of explanation we want in what kind of situation. So we'll often offer a scientific explanation where what we really need is a richer poetic description, and sometimes offer a poetic description or a diaristic entry where what's required is a pill.
Right.
And we get confused about those two. So keeping those two domains distinct, I think, is quite important for me. And there is no theory of everything. It's a kind of thing which I'm keen on saying.
I like this idea of the accident. It brings up this other question that I want to ask you about temporality, and certainly in my own education, it's not been linear. It wasn't like always going on a track. There are always swerves and detours, and there's something right in front of you, and then there's the kind of infinite unboundedness ahead. And I see two temporal modalities governing your work: the instant and the infinite. At least those two, possibly.
I was born in 1960, so I had the immense good fortune to be 16 in 1976, about 30 miles north of London, when punk began to happen. And on the plane here, I was just reading this book called Punk is Dead, Modernity Killed Every Night, which is a series of pieces about punk, which is really quite fascinating. But there's for me, whatever happened between the years 1976 and 1978, when I was a punk in that scene, everything I've done subsequently has come out of that. And it's just different modes of articulation of that stuff that was happening back when I was 16, 17, 18, for which I didn't have a vocabulary. I didn't know what I was doing, but key fundamental experiences occurred, accidents, strange things happened. And also that sense in which, the way in which the world first really opened up to me, like it does for many people, was through music, through pop music, through, ridiculous, meaningless 3-minute pop songs. That's the way the world opened up. And philosophy for me is a continuation, an elaboration of whatever was going on with that world opening up. And the sense in which, the nonlinear aspect of it is really, really important, and keeping that and remembering, those fundamental experiences you had, those experiences of alienation, of distance, of disgust, all those things that you have when you're a youth, as someone that teaches, to try and kind of feed back into that and remember how that was and how chaotic and strange things were when you were a youth, and to try and make whatever you're doing as a teacher available at that level, I think is really, really important. So I'm always looking for, when I'm in a classroom, I'm looking for, trying to save souls, and looking for disaffected weirdos that you can give them some different mode of articulation for their deepest anxieties, troubles, and desires. So whatever I call philosophy is a name for that, and making that clearer and more powerful and more perspicuous. And so for me, there's an intimate connection between philosophy as this abstract conceptual activity and these elemental passions that we feel, and one tries to articulate, refine, make sense of the other. And it's really important not to lose sight of that. And when you do, and you see this a lot in academia, everything becomes a kind of empty academic jargon, which will change every 2 or 3 years with fashion, and rapidly becomes pointless. So So that's important. On time, the instant and the infinite. The instant interests me in all sorts of ways. I mean, there's the instant of one's death. When I was living in Los Angeles in 2006, 2007, I wrote a book called The Book of Dead Philosophers, which was a catalogue of 190 philosophers' deaths, back to back, thanks to the fantastic library resources at UCLA, which I was able to use. And I was obsessed with this moment of death, and obviously petrified of it, and the way in which philosophy is an art of dying. So philosophy, on, let's say, the classical view, it's what Socrates says, and it's what most of the ancient schools taught. Philosophy is an ars moriendi, an art of dying. So the entire wisdom that philosophy can offer is what your relationship is to that instant of your death, and whether you can go to that death with something like equanimity or tranquility. That's the kind of the classical ideal, the pagan ideal. I've got a lot to say about that. So there's that instant. There's the instant of, say, music, of listening to a song, listening to, I don't know, the first 4 minutes, 33 seconds of David Bowie Station to Station, which were recorded in Los Angeles when he was living here, out of his mind on cocaine. And a bad time for David, but nonetheless it happened here. So that instant, there's the instant of music. There's the instant of, in the recent stuff, of, soccer, football. I mean, not ultimately one of the things that is really interesting about soccer, it's true of other sports, but I think in a particularly intense way in soccer, is the way in which time, you can feel time, you can feel the kind of malleability of time, right? So if you think about a soccer game, it lasts for 90 minutes, and those 90 minutes are measured in, equal units of 1 minute each. There's 90 of them with seconds or whatever, and they're added end to end. It's a line. The whole thing is a line of the pitch is marked out, and there it is. It's a completely linear, objective structure. And yet within that, when the game begins, time can switch. It can become enormously slow, and then it can speed up rapidly. So you actually can watch time shift. So a lot of the things that, philosophers that interest me are interested in, which you say the experience of time, you can see that on a football pitch. You can see you can witness an instant happening when time, as it were, accelerates and shifts, and also space at the same time is malleable, ductile, it shifts. So there's that. So the instant pops up in, all over my stuff in ways which I'm not really in control of. But the other dimension of time which really interests me is the past. I'm slowly writing a book on tragedy at the moment, which I've been thinking about for years. What is tragedy about? Tragedy is about the past. And the fact that, in the words of Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, also all about this town. As the man said, you might be through with the past, but the past isn't through with you. If you think you're through with the past will creep up behind you and destroy you. And that's what happens in tragedy. So if you become one of those people those godforsaken people who live for the moment, live for the now, you're going to be messed up by the past, and that transgenerational curse that the past bestows on you, which is what it means to be a human being. To be a human being is to come with this burden of the past, whatever your familial dispensation, kinship structure is. And that can be, heteronormative, it can be queer, it can be anything you like. You have that burden, and that burden has to be assumed and not disavowed in some affirmation of the now or the short-term future. That's important, I think. And the infinite, it's the infinity is a term that I don't mean it in any cosmic sense or any kind of, infinity as kind of, the universe. For me, infinity is what stares back at you in the eyes of another person, in the sense in which the other person is someone who I cannot comprehend, I cannot understand or subsume under a set of categories. Right?
There's a certain opacity.
Yeah, there's no opacity, there's a distance. So the relationship to the other person, who seems just like me, is a relationship to something that has an infinite quality, something that cannot be reduced to me or be instrumentalized by me. So back to instrumentalization again. And that's really important in terms of our thinking about our moral lives and what it means to have an ethical relationship to another person. Does that mean that you can comprehend, understand them, assume that you know? No, it doesn't. To have a relationship to another person, in particular with someone that you love, is to have a relationship to someone who is infinite, who cannot be understood straightforwardly. And that's where something like trust has to begin.
Some things are ticking time bombs, right? So you don't know when something's going to resonate with you. Like it might have been here all along, but it'll resonate with you 5 minutes from now or 5 years from now. I find that to be really compelling and powerful because it has an effect beyond its immediacy that is indeterminate and opaque in all the ways that you describe. So I wonder if you could say maybe a little bit more about the politics of resonance that I see it sort of latent in both of those texts, the Faith of the Faithless and the Bowie.
Yeah, I think another thing, another kind of huge, not necessarily mistake, but it's a kind of, it risks becoming just an ideological position, is that of engagement, as such, as a good in itself. Often it's better to be disengaged, to have a certain distance, and that's what, for me, what a lot of the music I still really like and that I've liked over my life is about. It resounds with you, its communication it's felt, it's the communication of some kind of emotion which is felt and which is a truth, and that truth is a truth which resounds, literally sounds through you, and at that point you become part, or you can become part of some tiny community of auditors of that music, part of some, imagined collective of maybe just you and the artist, or maybe 10 other people, and that's incredibly important. I mean, going back to punk was year zero, right? You could get rid of your entire music collection. It was all irrelevant, boring old fart, nonsense, reactionary hippies with too much body hair and stuff like that. And so we threw everything away apart from music by 3 bands, the MC5, the Velvet Underground, and Iggy and the Stooges. And then you could own the entire output of punk, let's say in early 1977, which was composed of, say, 5 or 6 singles, right? An EP, then maybe an album. There was nothing, but you felt part of some secret, almost invisible community that was where something was being communicated, resounding across this music to people who were usually people who wanted to be, who fantasized about the city, but who were living in the suburbs. So this kind of disaffected, alienated, petrified, disembodied this is kind of, there's resonance there. So I think resonance is also a way in which things can communicate, so the way in which groups can take form. It's also the way in which things can circulate. And that can be good or bad. There was undoubtedly, a resonance to Trump, right? A resonance that was not really articulated, it wasn't expressed, it was felt. And so these things can resound in very perplexing ways.
What resounds in Bowie is something that is not this propositional truth, timeless truth in terms of logic or reason, or empirical truth as something that one sort of identifies, but a truth that you've described in other places as creation, a truth that involves a fidelity, and that has to do with resonance. But so much of it is this idea of illusion, right? The construction of illusions or the belief in illusions seem to be productive. But they also
completely, yeah.
But they also set us up for disappointment.
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, I think in relationship to so truth. Begin with that. I mean, there were the truths of science, empirical truths, hypothesis, experiment, that stuff. There are truths of logic, which are true by virtue of their form, mathematical truth, formally true. So truth, isn't very interesting, right? As one of my teachers used to say, if you want truth, read a phone book. But there's a third dimension of truth, which is linked to what I call truth, right? So truth, it's a funny thing that the word truth in English is linked to fidelity, being true to, right? In German, treu, right? Loyalty, fidelity. So there's that dimension of truth, which is a truth which is felt, and a felt experience of fidelity. And I think that, going back to Bowie or to music, that's what's going on there. And there's a delusion, I think, to want to believe that felt truth that you experience through an artist, a musical artist, comes out of some authenticity in their being, right? So their authentic core is in there, their soul is in there, and it finds voice and you hear it. What artists like Bowie and movements like punk, but basically every youth culture movement I can think of, it's about the layerings of inauthenticity and fakery, right? And this is particularly the case in an artist like Bowie, who is working through images and telling you he's working through images, through personae, and he can put those on, take those off, whatever. The whole thing is inauthentic all the way down. And that inauthenticity, that self-consciousness of illusion, is not the opposite of truth, is what allows truth to happen. So it's when we give up the illusion of authenticity and we accept the productivity of illusion and fiction, then that gives us access to a different experience of truth. So for me, I think that's been very important in my work over the years is fiction, and that goes back to deep philosophical concerns that go back to philosophy after Kant and blah blah blah. But basically, it's the idea that the world is what you make of it, right? The world is what you make of it. The world is a fiction, right? It's a world which is put together, a world which is constructed in our image, and we can know that, right? We can call that social constructivism or something. What more can we do with that? Are there kinds of fiction which can acknowledge themselves as fiction and yet do something else, can punch through from that fictionality to something more profound? So I think that really interested me in the work of the poet Wallace Stevens was this idea of what he called the supreme fiction. The supreme fiction was a fiction that knew itself to be a fiction, yet a fiction that we believed to be true, the fiction of an absolute. To use fiction, to deploy fiction, but in a way that that pushes through fiction to something else. You could call that reality, or you could say that there's this great quote from Beckett from the late 30s, I think, where he talks about the highest thing of which a writer is capable is to to punch holes in language, to bore through language to the other side of it. You know, another way we're thinking about fiction is words, right? Words, and these words mean this, they mean that, they're ambiguous, their meanings can flip around, and we all know that. We're all linguistic constructivists, we're all kind of relativists about that. But is there a way of pushing through language to something else, something deeper, darker, more of a kind of a deeper sense of reality? I mean, I hope so.
Yeah. So you describe politics as the creation of interstitial distance within the state, right? Through which new political subjectivities are invented.
Yeah.
So now I hope that you can think with me what it would be like, what politics would look like in a post-national paradigm where there is no state against which or within which to create this interstitial distance. It seems to me when I read this idea of this interstitiality, and I see the space in between also embedded in this idea of semi-autonomy that I think you share with Liam Gillick. What would politics look like if there is no, like, what would be the buffer? What would be the thing against or within which to carve out these spaces for resonance, for a visceral kind of connection?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's harder and harder to answer. When I was last in Los Angeles, which was 10 years ago, I was finishing it was finished, but I was fiddling with the proofs of Infinitely Demanding. And Infinitely Demanding was a book that, I thought of, a bit naively as a manifesto at the time. And it had come out of a whole series of thoughts I'd had over the years in connection with people like Ernesto Laclau and others, and particularly with a lot of radical student groups and activist groups, that I was trying to kind of lay out an argument for an anarchist politics of resistance. And I focused on this idea of politics as the creation of interstitial distance within the state, which was then summarily beaten over the head by Slavoj Žižek, amongst other, in the name of a kind of a more classical Marxist-Leninist seizure of state power, because I was arguing that actually, capital and the state are always the problem. The question of anarchism is how one takes a distance from the state and how one creates that. And rather than thinking that there's an opposition between state and society, the way classical anarchism tends to think about it, to say that there's the state is always this surface, this domain which wants to, how would I put that, suture the whole of experience, glue it all together. And within that surface of the appearance of the state edifice, different kinds of articulations are possible, different kinds of resistance and movements are possible. And I was very interested in the sequence of events. This is odd. I was very interested in the sequence of events that went back to the Zapatistas and different things like that, and that came kind of overground with the battle in Seattle, and then what became the anti-globalization movement in the early 2000s, and then what became the anti-war movement, 2003, and the opposition to Republican National Convention, 2004 in New York, that sequence of events. And I was very involved in all that kind of stuff. Then I wrote that book. I was finishing that here in what seemed like a political reality I didn't understand in Los Angeles at all, but that was probably just me. And then sometime later, Occupy happened, and then there were occupations and here and elsewhere, and then Occupy Wall Street happened, and that seemed to be a kind of, for a lot of us, a summation of all this stuff that we've been thinking about for years, a temporary autonomous zone, whatever you want to call it. And it was beautiful and spectacular and joyous and short-lived, and then what? And then we look at, we tell the story of the last the last decade or last 8 years from that period, what story do we tell? And, you know, the history of the left in general, and in particular, the anarchism in particular, has always been a history of failure and defeat. You know, anarchism has not been a tremendous success politically over the years. There are certain brief moments. We had one, let's say, in a sequence that begins in the late 90s through to, say, Occupy Wall Street. Now we're into a very different sequence, it seems to me. And politics is always about understanding sequences and how those sequences are formed and what their genealogies are, what their archives are, and also what possibilities they offer. So there's a tendency, particularly on the left, to see politics in linear terms, you know, as if there's some progressive arc of history that's taking us all in a certain direction, which is, it's just not the case. I mean, there are fits and starts. There are moments when things happen, then they're usually crushed. And but the after effect of that thing that's crushed pops up again in another form. And then you can begin to tell a certain story about what popped up, how it popped up again, and we can then begin to think about that as a way of thinking about politics, right? I was in a room with a theologian and somebody else. We were talking about this and that, and this very earnest, good theologian was talking about how we need to engage and fight back and take the country back and all of that stuff. And everything she was saying was right, you know, totally worthy and probably the right thing to do. But there was a question from somebody, you know, in the front row. He said, kind of, why bother taking anything back? Why not just kind of do something else? And I kind of began to look at that as a kind of, here's a question: do we engage or disengage? Do we participate or walk away? And those two possibilities, I think, are there. And right now, I feel like walking away because, you know, if we continue to think about politics within the terrain of the state and capital, then, you know, we're going to be lost. So to that extent, the obsession with Trump, the left's obsession with Trump, is misplaced, right? It's the wrong place to look. Yeah, the federal state is a leviathan that's never going to be reformed. It's not that kind of thing. And what was interesting about the United States of America was never that. It was the fact that you could have this fairly awful state structure based on this weird confection of Roman republicanism and Puritanism, and it would do its business and it would be linked to the, you know, all the terrible things about the, right, anyway, but beneath the surface of that state structure, weird and interesting things can happen, often in relationship to religious communities in the US or utopian communities in the US. And that's where you look. So the question, you know, what is to be done is the wrong question. There are tons of people doing things all over the place. There are 1,000 things that are being done and will be done. It's a question of scale and a question of timing, if you like.
This is the Rousseauanist in your writing, the Rousseau moment in your writing.
Yeah, I think there's. I mean, I think the
question is scale.
Yeah, I think that the left has bought into a certain idea of globalization, and so I take Rousseau seriously in the sense in which Rousseau gave us in the social contract. Rousseau's a much more important thinker politically than Marx or anybody else for me, and Rousseau gives us a wonderful picture of how a legitimate society could be structured and what institutions it would have. It does it almost like almost like algebra. Then the question is, where could this happen? And then he begins to, you know, say, well, it has to happen somewhere very small. It has to happen somewhere where nobody else is really very bothered about what's going on in that place, that a place that doesn't have too much to do with it, other places. So scale, I think, is important. So once we buy into this idea of the mega state, the globalized world, in a sense we're lost. You have to begin from, where you are and the locality of where you are in a very kind of humble, boring, and piecemeal way. And that's what ultimately interests me about anarchism. I'm not interested in people in black balaclavas, talking about violence and who've got absolutely nothing at stake, right? I hate those people. But I think the idea that there are forms of activity that can take place. There are ways in which human beings can do things together, organize things together in this very humble and largely invisible way, for me, is kind of nothing short of miraculous. And that's a long way from the kind of boyish, masculine, Marxist, smash the state nonsense. And this comes back to a really important issue, which is a question of faith, ultimately. You could provide data for both views, but the question is this: are human beings good or bad, right? Are human beings fundamentally wicked or fundamentally decent? There's evidence that would make both arguments, and maybe the wickedness, badness argument trumps the other one. But it is my, faith, if you like, my, let's say, moral conviction that human beings are fundamentally decent and capable of extraordinary acts of decency within certain local confines, right? Within the place where they live and they work and they think and they eat. That's where it's located. And it's there that politics has to take place.
I think what you've just a minute ago you've laid out for us is how we might begin to correct for this confusion of consumerism as activism. But I also am wary. It feels like every kind of carving away of that space, that interstitial space, or any kind of like visceral connection, or what you've described as like heteroaffectivity. It seems to, like, capital seems to be able to commodify, subsume, spit back out at you as something that you can buy. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. If there were a way of overcoming capitalism, then capitalism would have worked out a way of selling it to you, right? There's no question about that. And there's something about the seamless commercialization of activism which is really, really worrying. And so I run this column with the New York Times, The Stone, and been doing that for about 7-8 years. We didn't get very many submissions on Barack Obama. And when Obama was the first election campaign in 2008 and in 2012, there were pieces, but there wasn't a huge amount of pieces. Right? Now there's a kind of, Trump has unleashed is a tidal wave of kind of, if you like, pseudo-resistance, which again, I understand why people are doing it. I don't disapprove of it. I'm not sure what it's for. It seems to me that the more important thing to do is to take a breath, maybe go somewhere else, or to focus on the, ethnographically, if you like, in terms of ethno-methodologically, in terms of the detail, the grain and the detail of ordinary people's lives and what led to the outcome that we're now living through. I think there's a kind of, it's too much activism in a way. And what particularly makes me nervous is the way in which the blurring of activism and education. I was thinking of this moment when Lacan went to Vincennes Saint-Denis, one of the experimental universities formed in the wake of '68 in Paris, and the students were occupying things. They were being, French students and complaining about capitalism, whatever. And Lacan went there and more or less said, you should continue with your studies. read some books, finish your studies, then go out into the world. And there's something obviously reactionary and provocative about that gesture, but interesting about it. It seems to be that the school I teach at, the New School, was was calling the police to lock up students 2008, 2009, and a lot of those students were my students, and that was the president of the New School. And now they have branded the New School as, social engagement, activism, we're training, and that makes me nervous, We're not doing that. We're reading difficult books really slowly in ways which can appear completely pointless and should appear completely pointless. And that's your provocation, right? Here's something you can't use either for your career or for your conscience, right? Just spend 3 months looking at this play by Sophocles or whatever and figure that one out, So there's something about, maybe this is a little bit perverse, but I think there's a sense in which academics are bought into a kind of, fake activism.
The theatricality, performance of it. Yeah.
And we've seduced ourselves into that as a way of believing that we're relevant. And that's not really what education's about.
Absolutely. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks very much, Jake.